February 20, 1943, began with a cold, metallic dawn over the Kasserine Pass, the kind of desert morning in which every sound traveled far and every shadow looked sharper than it should. The American positions stretched across the valley in scattered pockets of trenches, command tents, thin roadblocks, and half-prepared gun emplacements. Engines idled, exhaust fumes mixed with drifting sand, and young soldiers moved through the chill air, believing the hours ahead would bring nothing more than routine patrols and the slow push eastward. Confidence had grown carelessly during the previous weeks. Many believed the German forces were retreating in disarray. But beneath the calm surface of the morning lay a quiet tension, the invisible pressure that precedes a storm. It began without warning, a whistle in the air, a distant flash on a ridge, and then a shock wave that threw sand and debris into the sky. German artillery found the American lines with alarming accuracy as the first salvos crashed into supply trucks, communications tents, and infantry positions. Within seconds, the valley erupted into a landscape of fire and shattered equipment. Radios crackled with broken messages, drowned by explosions. The Americans, unused to facing such concentrated fire, scrambled for cover as the barrage intensified, ripping open the seams of their defensive line. And before the stunned soldiers could understand how badly they had been targeted, the second phase of the assault arrived. German armored columns emerged from morning dust like a dark tide, panzers moving with brutal coordination, half-tracks advancing behind them, infantry working in flawless rhythm. These were not inexperienced troops. They were veterans from years of mechanized warfare, men who understood the terrain, the angles of the pass, the timing required to break an enemy's spine. Their tanks rolled forward not with reckless speed, but with sharp, calculated precision. American anti-tank crews, many firing under combat pressure for the first time, hesitated, misjudged distances, or struck glancing blows against armor they underestimated. In minutes, key positions collapsed, and the narrow geography of Kasserine magnified every American mistake. Communication disintegrated. Units called for assistance that could not reach them. Entire companies received contradictory orders, advance, hold, retreat, until none of them knew what front they were facing. Officers unfamiliar with the ridge lines tried improvising maneuvers that funneled their own men into kill zones. Supply convoys jammed the few usable tracks, colliding with retreating vehicles as dust and smoke blinded drivers. Along the central corridor of the pass, American formations began to fracture, not from lack of courage, but from the sheer speed and violence of the German assault. The Wehrmacht carved through the disordered line, bypassing pockets of resistance, striking deep into the rear, and forcing a retreat that became a chaotic flight. By late afternoon, the Kasserine Pass had transformed into a graveyard of burned tanks, overturned trucks, scattered equipment, and abandoned trenches half filled with drifting sand. Men who had entered North Africa with pride now withdrew in stunned silence, faces gray with dust and disbelief. What had been expected to be a manageable engagement had revealed something far more devastating. The Americans had not merely been beaten, they had been outmatched in command, coordination, and combat experience. The speed of the German breakthrough made clear how unprepared the Second Corps really was. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the smoking pass, the implications of the day hung heavily over the battered landscape. The defeat at Kasserine was not just a battlefield setback, it was a moment that forced a new and frightening question into the heart of the Allied war effort. If the United States Army could be broken so completely in a single day, what would happen when the full weight of the Wehrmacht turned against it again?
In the days that followed the collapse at the Kasserine Pass, the Allied headquarters in North Africa became a place where every conversation carried the weight of failure. Inside canvas command tents stretched across the barren hills near Tebessa, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke, dust, and the bitter smell of burned fuel brought in by the desert wind. Maps lay pinned beneath canteens and revolvers, covered with shifting lines of red pencil and notes scrawled in haste. Officers moved between tables with stiff movements, their voices low, their expressions tight. The consequences of the defeat pressed down on them like a physical burden. It was not simply that a battle had been lost. It was that the myth of American readiness had shattered with it. British commanders, hardened by years of war, watched the aftermath with a mixture of professional disappointment and private frustration. Their reports spoke bluntly about disorganization, inadequate leadership, and an American army that had entered the desert believing it could learn on the move. In quiet corners of the headquarters, British staff officers exchanged glances that needed no words. They had warned that inexperience could be fatal against German veterans. Now, Kasserine had proven the point with brutal clarity. Across the desert, German propaganda picked at the wound, broadcasting mocking statements about American incompetence, describing the Second Corps as untrained and undisciplined. The psychological blow mattered almost as much as the tactical one. Within this atmosphere, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the heaviest decisions of his command to date. His calm exterior hid the pressure beneath. He understood the Allies could not afford another humiliation. The Desert Campaign was more than a regional fight. It was the proving ground for the American Army, the stage upon which its future role in Europe would be judged. Eisenhower met with Corps leaders one by one, listening as they recounted the confusion, the lost units, the breakdowns in communication, the failures to read the terrain. The excuses sounded thin even to those speaking them. The defeat had not come from lack of bravery. It had come from structural weakness, an army that had entered a professional war without understanding its demands. Eisenhower made his choices quickly, knowing hesitation would be interpreted as weakness. Commanders who had shown poor judgment were relieved. Officers who had proven incapable of coordinating their forces were reassigned or removed entirely. The Second Corps, as it had existed before Kasserine, would not continue unchanged. Eisenhower's directives called for a reorganization not only of leadership, but of doctrine, communications, and battlefield coordination. Behind closed flaps of the headquarters tent, he argued that the American Army must grow up in days, not years. He made clear that friendship and seniority meant nothing in the face of repeated failure. Survival, both military and political, depended on transformation. The mood across headquarters changed slowly, shifting from humiliation to steely resolve. Staff officers worked around the clock, revising operational plans, reassigning staff, and drafting new orders. American units arriving from rear areas sensed the tension and understood that something fundamental had shifted. The Desert War would no longer be treated as a place for learning. It would now be a place where mistakes carried consequences. Logistics officers reorganized supply routes. Signal Corps teams rewired communication networks. Intelligence officers analyzed the German assault with forensic detail, breaking down every move, every timing, every maneuver. The defeat was being dissected with a precision that matched the precision of the German attack. For the first time since entering North Africa, the Americans were confronting their weaknesses head-on. Political pressure from Washington collided with military necessity. British commanders, though critical, extended cooperation, offering their experience to reshape the underperforming corps. And in the center of this storm stood Eisenhower, a commander determined to ensure that the disaster at the pass would become the crucible in which a stronger army was forged. The burden was enormous, but the responsibility clearer than ever. Reshape the Second Corps, or risk watching the entire North African campaign unravel. As night fell over the headquarters and the desert wind rattled the tent walls, Eisenhower signed the final papers approving the removal of ineffective officers and the arrival of a new commander for the broken corps. In the silence that followed, the meaning of the signature tightened like a knot around the fate of the American Army. The transformation had begun, but whether it would be enough to prevent the next disaster remained an unanswered looming question.
When General George S. Patton arrived to take command of the battered II Corps in early March 1943, the atmosphere in the American camps shifted as sharply as a desert windstorm turning the sky from blue to burning red. His entrance was not dramatic by intention, but by presence alone. Polished helmet catching the sun, revolver at his hip, boots striking the ground with the measured rhythm of a man who accepted nothing less than uncompromising order. Soldiers stopped talking when he passed. Officers straightened instinctively. Patton did not need to announce authority. He radiated it. And after Kasserine, authority was exactly what the American Army lacked. What he found was an army still stung by humiliation, weighed down by exhaustion, and uncertain of its own abilities. Units were scattered and disorganized. Trenches were shallow, weapons dirty, vehicles in poor repair after frantic retreats across the pass. Many soldiers carried a quiet sense of shame, remembering the panic that had taken hold when the German attack broke through. Patton saw all of it in a single walk through the forward camps, and his reaction was immediate. He punished sloppiness, demanded discipline, and insisted that every detail, from shaved faces to clean rifles, became part of the rebuilding process. For Patton, disorder was not a symptom. It was a disease that killed armies long before enemy shells ever reached them. Inspections became relentless. He appeared at dawn to check uniforms, examined weapon racks by running gloved fingers across the metal to ensure they were perfectly oiled, and questioned soldiers directly about procedures and responsibilities. Work crews repaired trenches until their hands blistered. Mechanics restored engines into condition worthy of combat. Artillerymen calibrated their guns repeatedly, memorizing new firing tables. Every man, regardless of rank, felt the weight of Patton's expectations. Some resented him openly, viewing his demands as an insult added to the wounds of defeat. But others, even begrudgingly, began to sense a purpose taking shape beneath the pressure. Patton's discipline was more than ritual. It was psychological reconstruction. Kasserine had torn at the core of the American Army's self-belief. The general understood that restoring morale required more than speeches or reassurances. It required the physical rebuilding of order so that confidence could return through action, not hope. Under his command, routines became strict, maneuvers became sharper, and standards rose day by day. Training intensified. Marches grew longer. Weapons drills became grueling. Mistakes that had once been tolerated now carried consequences. It was not cruelty. It was recalibration, a crash course in survival delivered by a commander who had learned the cost of weakness. Within 2 weeks, changes became visible. Drills ran more smoothly. Patrols moved with sharper coordination. Units no longer drifted through camp like scattered parts. They moved with cohesion. Soldiers who had once doubted themselves now stood straighter, their voices more certain when giving or receiving orders. Conversations in the evenings shifted from bitterness to determination. The shame of Kasserine had not vanished, but it had hardened into resolve. The Second Corps was no longer an army stumbling through the desert. It was becoming an army preparing to fight with the precision the Germans had shown them. Patton himself remained a constant force, fierce, disciplined, unyielding. He drove his staff without pause, reviewed battle plans late into the night, and visited frontline companies unexpectedly to gauge their readiness. He pushed officers to study terrain, memorize enemy tactics, and understand the reality of mechanized warfare rather than trust assumptions or outdated doctrine. He did not accept the idea that the Americans were naturally inferior in experience. To him, inferiority was a temporary condition that discipline could erase. And slowly, unmistakably,
The Second Corps reshaped itself around his will. The desert camps echoed now with the sounds of drills, repaired engines, and sharkened commands. Order replaced confusion. Purpose replaced humiliation. And as the days passed, the men who had tasted defeat began to believe that the next encounter with the Germans would not be a repeat of Kasserine. Yet, as discipline restored strength, one truth hung over the camps with the weight of a gathering storm. The enemy was moving too, preparing for the next confrontation. And soon, Patton's rebuilt army would face its first real test, one that would reveal whether discipline alone could stand against the Wehrmacht.
As the dust of Kasserine settled and Patton's discipline began hardening the Second Corps into a coherent fighting force, another transformation was unfolding behind the front, quieter, less visible, but no less revolutionary. In makeshift headquarters carved from abandoned farmhouses, tents reinforced with sandbags, and dimly lit planning rooms where maps were patched together with tape and pins, American officers worked with an urgency that bordered on desperation. The defeat had made one thing unmistakably clear. The Army had not failed because its soldiers lacked bravery, but because its doctrine had failed them. Something fundamental in the way the Americans fought had to change, and it had to change immediately. The lessons of the disaster were dissected with forensic intensity. What had gone wrong in artillery coordination? Why had tanks been thrown into duels they were never meant to win? Why had communication networks collapsed under pressure? The answers formed an uncomfortable truth. The Americans had been fighting the wrong kind of war, relying on assumptions forged in training fields rather than realities dictated by German veterans. Now, every assumption was placed under scrutiny. Officers tore apart manuals, covered walls with diagrams, and argued until sunrise over how to rebuild the structure of their force. The first piece to be rewritten was artillery doctrine. At Kasserine, guns had fired as isolated assets, each battery responding to its own fragment of the battlefield. That would not happen again. Firepower would now be centralized, coordinated, and unleashed in massed concentrations capable of shaping entire engagements. Signal officers laid new wire, tested radios in sandstorms, and rehearsed fire missions until gunners could respond to calls in seconds rather than minutes. The aim was not accuracy alone, but overwhelming volume, a storm of steel capable of freezing German momentum before it gathered strength. Armor tactics came next. American tanks, brave but misused, had been thrown headlong into frontal duels with veteran panzer crews who understood every nuance of desert fighting. The new doctrine refused to repeat that mistake. Tank destroyers, faster, more agile, and better suited for ambush, would take the anti-armor role. Tanks themselves would become tools of support, moving with infantry, shielding advances, and exploiting breakthroughs rather than seeking duels. Officers studied terrain lines, rehearsed ambush positions along wadis and rocky outcrops, and drilled crews on camouflage, speed, and timing. The new approach treated mobility as a weapon and concealment as the first step of survival. A third pillar emerged from the chaos: air-ground cooperation. At Kasserine, the Americans had in effect fought two separate battles, one on the ground and one in the air, each unaware of the other's needs. Now a communication system began to take shape in which forward air controllers, ground radio teams, and fighter-bomber pilots would operate as extensions of each other. The aim was not merely to destroy targets, but to create constant pressure, forcing the Germans to react to threats from above and ahead simultaneously. Maps were updated with designated strike zones. Codes were redesigned to avoid confusion. Airfields coordinated their timing so aircraft could be overhead within minutes of a request. Within these rooms, the energy was relentless. Officers drank cold coffee, worked by lantern light, and scribbled revisions that passed hand to hand across long wooden tables. What other nations took years to develop, the Americans attempted in days. It was not elegance, it was necessity, a race to rebuild doctrine faster than the Germans could exploit its weaknesses again. The men shaping these ideas understood that nothing short of a tactical reinvention would prevent another catastrophe. Outside the planning rooms, the effect of these changes began to seep into training grounds. Artillerymen practiced massed fire drills that shook the desert. Tank destroyer crews rehearsed ambushes until their movements became instinct. Infantry officers studied terrain relentlessly, learning to see ridgelines and valleys as opportunities rather than obstacles. Air-ground exercises filled the sky with dust and noise as pilots and ground teams experimented with coordination that had never existed before. The Second Corps was not just improving, it was evolving, adapting in real time to the demands of a war it had once underestimated. Yet the urgency behind every reform carried a haunting truth. No matter how quickly doctrine was rewritten, no matter how hard the officers worked, the real measure of these changes would come only on the battlefield. Somewhere beyond the hills, the Germans were preparing their own moves. The next clash would reveal whether the Americans had rebuilt not just their structure, but their ability to fight and survive. And as the days counted down toward that confrontation, one question loomed over the desert like a gathering heat wave. Had the Second Corps learned fast enough to withstand what was coming?
By mid-March 1943, the American Second Corps was no longer the disjointed force that had stumbled through Kasserine. As the rebuild formations pushed south through the rugged approaches of central Tunisia, a quiet transformation traveled with them. The roads toward Gafsa and El-Guettar were lined with convoys that moved not in chaotic waves, but in deliberate, ordered columns. Supply trucks rolled in steady rhythm, their cargo secured and catalogued. Engineers marched ahead to clear passages through narrow wadis. Artillery units advanced with precision, their guns lashed tightly to carriages that no longer bore the scars of neglect. What had once been an army held together by haste and hope was now driven by structure, discipline, and a new understanding of war. The capture of Gafsa came with little resistance, but it revealed how deeply the Americans had changed. Positions were dug immediately, trenches carved into hard earth, firing slits aligned with the natural contours of the valley. Camouflage nets hung over newly placed batteries. Supply officers rapidly charted routes for ammunition, fuel, and rations, turning the town into a logistical heartbeat for the operation to come. Tank destroyer crews slipped into positions along narrow defiles, using the broken Tunisian terrain to conceal every movement. Patrols scouted the surrounding ridges with a sharpness that had been absent weeks earlier. The Second Corps had learned that survival depended on preparation measured not in hours, but in minutes. From Gafsa, the advance toward El-Guettar pressed deeper into enemy territory. The desert widened into sweeping valleys bordered by rugged hills, a landscape perfectly suited for armored maneuver and deadly ambushes. The Americans took nothing for granted. Every ridge was mapped, every track examined for signs of German movement. Artillerymen plotted arcs of fire that overlapped like interlocking shields. Communications teams ran wire along dry stream beds and improvised repeater stations in sheltered depressions. Officers tested radio links repeatedly, knowing that a single failure could break the fragile chain holding the newly rebuilt corps together. Yet even as the Americans fortified their positions, another army was moving in parallel. After Rommel's departure to Germany for medical reasons, German forces in Tunisia passed under new command. The 10th Panzer Division, battle-hardened, confident, sharpened by years of victories from France to Russia, prepared to meet the American advance with the expectation of another easy triumph. Its officers viewed the Second Corps through the lens of past battles, inexperienced, prone to panic, lacking cohesion. Reports of Patton's disciplinary measures circulated through German intelligence channels, but they were dismissed as superficial. The Germans expected an army that would break at the first concentrated blow. Along the approaches to El-Guettar, the contrast between the two forces grew sharper with each passing day. American soldiers moved with purpose born from humiliation, determination, and the pressure of transformation. They dug deeper,
camouflaged more carefully, checked and rechecked every emplacement. Tank destroyers lay hidden behind rock formations, their engines cold, their crews rehearsing the moment they would spring into action. Infantry companies spread across the valley floor in layered positions that forced the Germans into narrowing kill zones. Artillery observers climbed ridges before dawn, their silhouettes blending with the shadows as they memorized every fold of terrain that might matter in the coming fight. The Germans, meanwhile, advanced with the confidence of a force that had rarely been matched. Their armored columns rolled through the Tunisian hills, engines humming in precise mechanical harmony. Panzer crews laughed around evening fires, certain that the Americans would crumble as they had at Kasserine. Their officers studied maps and nodded knowingly at the terrain, an open valley flanked by high ground, perfect for armored exploitation. They believed the Americans would react slowly, communicate poorly, and scatter under pressure. Their expectations were not born from arrogance alone, they were grounded in recent memory. But the battlefield ahead would not resemble the one they had faced in February. As both armies edged closer to El-Guettar, the valley seemed to hold its breath. The air carried the metallic tang of fuel and the faint rumble of distant engines as the space between the two forces narrowed. Every night, American sentries watched pinpricks of moving lights on the far ridges, German armor positioning, preparing, tightening their formation. Every morning, dust clouds rose on the horizon as the 10th Panzer Division closed the final distance. Two armies were converging, one forged by years of victory, the other reshaped by a single devastating defeat. The desert, indifferent and vast, waited for dawn to decide which one had learned enough to survive. And in the final hours before battle, a tense silence settled over the American lines, broken only by the distant echo of approaching engines that signaled the fight was about to begin.
At dawn on March 23, 1943, the valley of El-Guettar lay beneath a pale, colorless sky, the air still and cold enough that the breath of every soldier hung briefly before disappearing into the morning light. Along the American lines, silence sat heavily in the trenches and gun pits, broken only by the distant whisper of wind sliding across the stony ridges. The men of the Second Corps waited, some gripping rifles, others adjusting binoculars or whispering final instructions to their crews. They had been told the Germans were coming, but the scale and direction of the attack were still unknown. And then, as the sun crept over the eastern mountains, they heard it, the deep rolling thunder of engines advancing in unison. The German 10th Panzer Division emerged with the confidence of a force accustomed to bending battlefields to its will. Their armored spearhead pushed through the valley floor in tight formation. Panzers moving as if rehearsed, their hulls cutting through morning dust while motorcycle scouts fanned Eved. German officers believed they were about to repeat the triumph of Kasserine, shock the Americans, shatter their defenses, and roll through the pass before midday. Their guns opened fire in smooth rhythms, probing forward positions, expecting them to collapse under pressure. But the valley they entered that morning was not the one they had conquered a month earlier, and the army they approached was no longer a shaken, inexperienced force. The first surprise came when a leading panzer triggered an American minefield. A deafening blast lifted the tank into the air before dropping it onto its side, smoke curling from the ruptured armor. A second and third explosion followed, ripping gaps through the advancing columns. German formations bunched up in the narrowing terrain, their timing disrupted. And in that moment of hesitation, the new American artillery doctrine revealed itself with brutal clarity. From the ridges and hidden valleys encircling the battlefield, massed American guns unleashed a coordinated barrage so precise and overwhelming that the entire valley trembled. Shells crashed down in perfectly timed sequences, smashing into stalled German armor, tearing through half-tracks, and forcing infantry to scatter for cover. Tank destroyer crews lying silent in concealed positions seized the moment. They opened fire with disciplined volleys, striking the exposed flanks of immobilized panzers.
Their shots echoed across the valley like the heartbeat of a machine that had finally found its rhythm. One by one, German tanks burned, black columns of smoke rising as the desert wind fanned the flames. The Americans did not rush or panic. They fired, repositioned, and fired again with a professionalism that had been absent only weeks earlier. Every movement reflected the new doctrine: discipline, coordination, and use of terrain as a weapon. German officers tried to regain momentum, ordering units to push through the firestorm, but every advance met another layer of American defense. Infantry positions dug deeply into the valley floor refused to break. Machine gun nests poured fire into the gaps between German formations. Mortar crews adjusted their ranges with practiced speed. And high above, fighter-bombers swooped in to strike at German columns forced into the open by artillery fire. The Germans attacked again and again, each time believing the Americans would finally yield under pressure. Each time they were repelled with the same devastating precision. As the battle raged into the afternoon, the desert filled with smoke, the sharp smell of burning oil, and the metallic tang of shell fragments scattered across the sand. German resilience, forged on countless European battlegrounds, met an American army that had shed its confusion and found its identity in the crucible of humiliation. The Second Corps fought not like the raw force of Kasserine, but like a rebuilt army, one that understood its doctrine, trusted its leaders, and moved with a determination sharpened by the memory of defeat. El-Guettar had not been easy, nor had it been perfect, but as the darkness settled over the scarred valley and the guns finally fell silent, one truth resonated across every ridge and foxhole. In just 27 days, the United States Army had risen from the ashes of Kasserine and transformed itself into a fighting force capable of meeting the Wehrmacht on its own terms. El-Guettar was not just a victory, it was the moment when the United States proved that it could learn faster than its enemies, adapt under fire, and turn humiliation into strength.